May 3, 1945. The war in Europe is gasping its final breaths. Snow still clings to the jagged shoulders of the Austrian Alps, melting into thin streams that cut through the mud of a narrow mountain road near Reutte. An American convoy halts, jeeps idling, exhaust curling in the cold morning air. Soldiers step out cautiously, weapons slung but ready. Ahead, a group of exhausted German men wait with hands raised. Their faces are pale, uniforms torn, boots caked with grime. One of them, tall and thin, clutches a notebook, its pages filled with sketches of engines, rockets, and mathematical formulas. His name is Wernher von Braun. He and his team are not surrendering to avoid prison. They are surrendering to secure their future. Behind them, wooden crates marked V2 sit stacked on the roadside, guarded by nervous engineers rather than soldiers. Unseen beyond the ridge, Soviet troops advance from the east. British patrols move from the north. The war is ending, but the race for Germany's science is only beginning. By the spring of 1945, Europe was a continent in ruins. The Third Reich, once stretching from the French coast to the gates of Moscow, was collapsing under the relentless weight of Allied armies. Entire cities lay in ashes, Berlin bombed beyond recognition, Hamburg a skeletal wasteland, Dresden a haunting memory of firestorms. But beneath the rubble and the surrendering armies, another kind of battle was quietly unfolding. One fought not with tanks or planes, but with briefcases, notebooks, and scientific minds. Across Allied headquarters, intelligence reports were flooding in about extraordinary German technologies. Jet fighters that could outrun propellers, rockets that could touch the edge of space, nerve gases deadlier than anything the world had seen, and synthetic materials that defied conventional chemistry. Each discovery hinted at something terrifying and valuable. Germany's scientists, engineers, and research facilities had become the most coveted spoils of war. This new conflict was not about borders or ideology. It was about knowledge that could decide the balance of global power for decades to come. The Allies understood that whoever controlled the intellectual remains of the Third Reich would control the future. Within the war's final months, secret orders circulated through American, British, and Soviet commands: capture the labs, seize the documents, and secure the scientists, alive if possible. The Americans launched the Alsos mission, a covert operation designed to hunt down Germany's scientific infrastructure before it fell into Soviet hands. Operating behind advancing front lines, Alsos teams followed tank divisions into German territory, raiding research facilities, interrogating scientists, and confiscating classified data. At the same time, the British organized T-Force and the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS, their own scientific raiding units tasked with identifying and securing technological assets of value to post-war reconstruction and military advancement. In the East, the Soviets were moving just as swiftly. Their reconnaissance units, backed by political officers and engineers, swept through occupied zones, marking factories, laboratories, and institutes for immediate seizure. In many cases, they dismantled entire facilities, machines, blueprints, and personnel included, and transported them back to the Soviet Union. But for all the strategic coordination, much of this operation unfolded in chaos. The front lines shifted daily, and communication between Allied commands was often delayed or inconsistent. Scientists on the run had no clear enemy or savior, only choices. Some fled westward, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Red Army. Others went underground, destroying documents or hiding research material to negotiate better terms later. At Peenemünde, where the V2 rocket had first been tested, a handful of engineers buried key components in the dunes to prevent their capture. In southern Germany, chemical specialists destroyed laboratories rather than allow them to fall into Soviet hands. Yet despite these acts of desperation, Allied units advanced too quickly. Within weeks, they had discovered not just machinery, but an entire ecosystem of scientific achievement that would reshape the post-war world. The Americans were astonished by what they found. German jet aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Me 262 demonstrated a technological leap unmatched by any Allied fighter. The V-2 ballistic missile, though crude in reliability, was a glimpse into the coming age of intercontinental warfare. German advances in radar, guidance systems, submarine design, and synthetic fuels were so extensive that even experienced Allied scientists struggled to grasp their full implications. And yet, a dilemma hung over every discovery. The Nuremberg trials were being prepared to hold Nazi leaders accountable for their crimes. How, then, could the victors justify protecting and employing the very men who had built Hitler's war machine? The moral boundaries blurred with each new laboratory uncovered. War had made pragmatists of everyone. Across Allied lines, field officers were faced with impossible choices. A captured physicist might have been a party member, even a Nazi officer, but his knowledge could save the lives of future soldiers or launch an entire nation into a new technological era. Paper trails were rewritten. Files were sanitized. Scientists were quietly moved from prison camps to military offices. By May 1945, it was clear that the physical war was ending, but the intellectual war, for ideas, data, and talent, was only beginning. In the ruins of Germany's research empire, the future of the Cold War was being born, not with a gunshot, but with a handshake between captors and captives. The front lines were now laboratories and factories, and the victors were no longer generals, but scientists. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world was divided not only by ideology, but by access to Germany's scientific legacy. What had once been a single empire of laboratories was now scattered across 4 occupation zones, each patrolled by a different flag. Inside these shattered zones, the Allies scrambled to seize what remained of Hitler's secret projects, each with its own strategy, its own moral compromises, and its own vision for the post-war order. For the United States, this mission would become Operation Paperclip, a clandestine effort that redefined both victory and morality. Under the control of the U.S. Army's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, Paperclip's goal was clear: recruit as many German scientists, engineers, and technicians as possible before the Soviets could reach them. On paper, the operation was presented as a temporary research collaboration. In practice, it was an all-out extraction campaign. Files were sanitized to erase Nazi affiliations, documents were rewritten to downplay war crimes, and personal histories were quietly reconstructed. More than 1,600 scientists and their families were secretly brought to America. Among them were figures who would later shape the entire technological trajectory of the 20th century. Wernher von Braun, the visionary behind the V-2 rocket, became the father of NASA's Saturn V, the rocket that carried men to the moon. Kurt Debus became the first director of Kennedy Space Center. Arthur Rudolph managed the Redstone Arsenal. Many had been members of the Nazi Party, some even of the SS. Yet in the shadow of the coming Cold War, their pasts were buried under the urgent need for technological supremacy. The Soviet Union, however, was not far behind. The Red Army's intelligence divisions had already compiled detailed lists of German scientific institutions through the war years. As soon as they captured Berlin, they launched massive trophy brigades, raiding laboratories, universities, and factories across their occupied territories. Everything of value, equipment, blueprints, and personnel was crated and shipped eastward. In October 1946, the Soviets conducted Operation Osoaviakhim, one of the largest forced relocations of technical experts in history. In a single night, thousands of German scientists and engineers, along with their families, were taken from their homes and transported to the Soviet Union. Many didn't even have time to pack their belongings. Within weeks, Soviet industry was reassembling entire German laboratories in cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and the remote regions of Kazakhstan. These specialists contributed directly to the early Soviet advances in rocketry, jet propulsion, and nuclear physics, technologies that would soon form the backbone of the USSR's superpower status. Britain, too, launched its own exploitation programs. Under Operation Surgeon, British intelligence targeted the Luftwaffe's research facilities, seeking to understand the secrets of German jet and missile technology. Engineers were interrogated, documents seized, and aircraft shipped to testing centers across the United Kingdom. Another mission, Operation Backfire, conducted live test launches of captured V-2 rockets on the North Sea coast, providing the West's first practical understanding of ballistic missile mechanics. France, though devastated by the occupation, refused to be left behind. Determined to rebuild its technological independence, the French government recruited hundreds of German specialists under its own initiative, offering amnesty and security in exchange for expertise. These scientists went on to influence French aerospace, nuclear energy, and industrial research during the nation's post-war reconstruction. Amid this global scramble, the lines between liberation and exploitation blurred. Officially, the Allies were dismantling the Nazi war machine. Unofficially, they were rebuilding it under new management and new flags. Laboratories once adorned with swastikas now bore the insignia of Allied commands. Many scientists, once fearful of Allied retribution, now found themselves welcomed as invaluable assets. The victors needed them, and they knew it. This competition was not just about technology, it was about prestige. Whoever mastered the jet engine, the ballistic missile, and nuclear energy would dominate the post-war world. The US and USSR were no longer fighting for Europe. They were fighting for the future itself. From Washington to Moscow, every major government understood that Germany's research was the key to unlocking a new kind of power, one not won by armies, but by engineers and equations. And so, beneath the public image of victory and reconstruction, a silent conflict was brewing, a race for knowledge that would ignite a new geopolitical era. The battlefields had turned into laboratories. The weapons were no longer rifles or tanks, but ideas, data, and human intelligence. The war for territory was over. But the war for brains, machines, and the secrets of the Third Reich had only just begun. In the ashes of Germany's surrender, the world's most powerful nations began dissecting the same corpse. Each superpower approached the spoils of Nazi science from a different angle, human, tactical, and technological, but the prize was universal: supremacy in the next era of warfare. Beneath the formal treaties and post-war rhetoric, this was the true face of the new conflict. One measured not in bombs dropped, but in patents stolen, data extracted, and minds recruited. The human angle was perhaps the most complicated. Germany's scientists were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were men who had once been hailed as heroes of the Reich, some ideologues, some opportunists, and some merely survivors. They had built engines that carried death across continents, designed gases that could wipe out battalions, and advanced theories that reshaped aviation and physics. Now, standing before their captors, they faced a question that was both moral and existential. Was their genius worth more than their guilt? To the Americans and Soviets, the answer was pragmatic. Intelligence officers were instructed not to ask what these men had done during the war, but what they could do now. A brilliant mind could be forgiven if it served the right flag. Von Braun and his rocket team were prime examples, responsible for weapons that had killed thousands in London and Antwerp, yet hailed as visionaries once they crossed into Allied custody. They understood something their captors did not. Science had no allegiance. It could be bought, traded, or coerced. The tactical angle defined how the Allies moved in this new battleground. Speed was everything. When the Nazi command collapsed, so did its security network, and suddenly entire research facilities were up for grabs. American and Soviet units raced across Germany not just to capture cities, but to claim scientists and laboratories. Commanders sent tanks to secure research institutes as if they were fortresses. In one instance, an American armored division was ordered to divert its route, not to engage German troops, but to reach a physics laboratory rumored to be working on a supersonic aircraft. This was more than greed, it was strategy. The Allies knew that post-war military dominance would depend not on how many soldiers they had, but how far their weapons could reach. The V-2 rocket, though unreliable, had demonstrated something profound: the power to strike across borders without warning. Whoever could perfect such technology would hold the future in their hands. American teams collected thousands of blueprints, prototypes, and test results from facilities in Mittelwerk, Nordhausen, and Peenemünde. Many of these sites were built with forced labor, an uncomfortable truth buried beneath layers of classified reports. The data extracted from these places would later guide the design of the first American missiles, high-altitude aircraft, and even early space vehicles. In the Soviet zone, engineers and soldiers swarmed factories in Thuringia and Saxony, marking crates with red stars before shipping them east. Some laboratories were dismantled down to their floors. Others were sealed, guarded, and operated under Soviet supervision. The technological angle revealed just how far Germany had been ahead of its time. Allied scientists, poring over captured documents, were stunned by the sophistication of German research. Jet propulsion, once a distant dream, had become reality in aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational jet fighter. The Heinkel, a 162 built hastily at the war's end, was a glimpse into mass-produced jet technology that could have changed the course of the conflict had it been deployed sooner. In the field of rocketry, the V-2 was the crown jewel, a 14-meter missile capable of reaching the stratosphere and delivering a ton of explosives hundreds of kilometers away. It was the first human-made object to cross the boundary of space. The Allies realized that the same physics that guided the V-2 to London could one day send payloads or people beyond the atmosphere. In metallurgy, radar, and synthetic fuels, German breakthroughs were years ahead of Allied development. Even the infamous chemical weapons research, especially nerve agents like tabun and sarin, revealed terrifying new frontiers of human destruction. But technology alone wasn't what made this race so dangerous. It was the fusion of science and ideology. The same laboratories that had built weapons for Hitler now stood ready to serve the next global empire. American generals saw German research as a shortcut to decades of innovation. Soviet leaders saw it as a matter of survival. The world's two emerging superpowers were learning the same lesson at the same time. That knowledge was the new weapon of mass destruction. The story of these angles, human, tactical, and technological, was not one of morality but of necessity. Every decision made in the name of national security blurred the line between justice and exploitation. By 1946, the scientists who had once sworn loyalty to the Führer were designing rockets for the Pentagon, building engines for the Royal Air Force, and teaching advanced mechanics in Moscow. Germany had lost the war, but its science had won a new kind of victory. Its intellectual empire survived, divided, repurposed, but alive. From missile silos in New Mexico to wind tunnels in Siberia, fragments of the Reich's ambition had been reborn under different flags. The world had entered a new era, one in which scientists were the soldiers and laboratories were the battlefields. But behind every achievement lay the same uneasy question: what price had been paid for progress? And as each nation built its new foundations on the knowledge of a fallen enemy, the lines between liberation and complicity grew fainter. If the human and tactical dimensions of the race for Nazi science revealed its urgency, the leadership, intelligence, and moral angles exposed its deeper contradictions. The world's victors had inherited not only technology, but also the ethical chaos that came with it. Each leader faced the same dilemma. How far could one go in pursuit of progress before becoming indistinguishable from the defeated enemy? For the leadership angle, the decisions made in Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris were not merely strategic, they were existential. President Harry S. Truman, who had publicly committed the United States to a policy of denazification, quietly authorized Operation Paperclip after being persuaded that the Soviets were moving faster. His advisors argued that to deny America the minds behind Germany's advanced weapons would be to hand the future to Stalin. Truman reluctantly agreed, but insisted on one rule: no ardent Nazis should be recruited. Yet within months, military officers were falsifying biographical records to ensure that high-value scientists could pass security checks. The line between pragmatism and hypocrisy vanished almost overnight. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin approached the same problem from the opposite direction, but with the same objective. For him, German science was not a prize of war, but a weapon of vengeance. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million lives. It could not afford to lag behind the West in technology. Stalin's orders were clear and ruthless: seize everything. When Soviet forces entered occupied zones, they treated laboratories like captured fortresses. Scientists were not collaborators, they were reparations. Those who resisted cooperation were threatened, sometimes arrested, and quietly transported to the East. The result was a vast, state-controlled assimilation of German intellect into the Soviet industrial machine. Britain's approach reflected its own pragmatic restraint. Having neither the vast resources of the United States nor the political might of the USSR, London's goal was intelligence exploitation. Under the direction of Winston Churchill, and later Clement Attlee, British missions like Operation Surgeon and Operation Backfire sought to extract specific technologies: jet propulsion, radar, submarine design, before the Americans monopolized them. British teams interrogated hundreds of German engineers, offering modest protection in exchange for cooperation. Yet even Britain was not immune to moral compromise. Several scientists with Nazi ties were quietly employed in government research facilities, their pasts conveniently overlooked for the sake of national interest. France, emerging from occupation and humiliation, saw opportunity in redemption. Under Charles de Gaulle, the French government sought to rebuild its military and technological prestige by recruiting skilled German personnel. For France, this was not just about competition. It was about regaining dignity. Many German experts were offered amnesty and citizenship in exchange for their expertise, particularly in aerospace and atomic research. By the early 1950s, French laboratories were populated by men who, only a few years earlier, had worked for the Reich's war machine. The intelligence angle of this scientific struggle was perhaps the most secretive of all. Intelligence agencies on both sides treated information as currency. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, compiled massive dossiers on German scientists, sometimes negotiating directly with them behind military lines. In one extraordinary case, American agents intercepted Soviet convoys to rescue certain German researchers bound for the East. Meanwhile, Soviet NKVD officers ran extensive operations across occupied Germany, bribing or coercing scientists to relocate voluntarily. Beyond the individuals themselves, the Allies discovered an even greater treasure: documentation. German patents, research papers, and laboratory journals were copied en masse. The Americans captured over 1,500 tons of technical documents, shipping them to Wright Field in Ohio for analysis. The British catalogued thousands more, while the Soviets sent entire archives to secret facilities near Moscow. This flood of intelligence became the blueprint for the technological Cold War, fueling innovations in nuclear weapons, aerospace engineering, and advanced materials. But the moral angle cast the darkest shadow. In the pursuit of progress, truth became expendable. At the Nuremberg trials, while generals and political leaders faced justice, many scientists who had served the Nazi regime were quietly excused or shielded. The justification was simple but chilling. Their knowledge was too valuable to destroy. Some of these men had overseen horrific experiments in concentration camps. Others had contributed to weapons programs built on slave labor. Yet, in classified corridors of power, their crimes were quietly erased by the ink of bureaucratic necessity. This moral blindness was not unique to any one nation. It was a shared affliction. The same societies that had fought to end tyranny now found themselves bargaining with its architects. Publicly, they spoke of democracy and justice. Privately, they traded in secrets and silence. For every scientist who advanced humanity's understanding of space, there was another whose work had been born in suffering. And so, while the world celebrated peace, a quiet cynicism settled over its laboratories. Rockets were tested not only to explore the heavens, but to deliver warheads. Jet engines promised faster travel and faster destruction. Each discovery was haunted by its origins. The Cold War that soon followed was not just a clash of ideologies. It was a race between two superpowers built on the same foundation: the scientific legacy of the Third Reich. In the end, the question that haunted the victors was not who won the war, but what they had become to win it. As the world's leaders congratulated themselves on victory, deep within their new laboratories, the next great battle was already beginning. A battle for control of the skies, the atom, and the very limits of human invention. By the autumn of 1946, Europe was scarred but rebuilding. Nations were counting their dead, reconstructing their cities, and searching for moral meaning after the storm. Yet in the shadows of this fragile peace, one of the largest and most secret scientific operations in human history was about to unfold, a move that would reshape the balance of power for the next half-century. The operation had a name whispered among Western intelligence circles with awe and disbelief: Osoaviakhim. On the night of October 22, 1946, Soviet security forces struck with clockwork precision across their occupation zone in Germany. In a single coordinated action, trucks rolled through the quiet streets of towns and villages from Saxony to Thuringia. Inside, soldiers pounded on doors, reading from lists prepared weeks in advance. German scientists, engineers, and technicians, along with their families, were ordered to pack immediately. Most were told they would be working temporarily in Soviet factories. Many believed it was an administrative transfer, but within hours, they were escorted under armed guard to railway stations, their homes sealed, their laboratories emptied. Over 2,200 leading specialists and their families, nearly 10,000 people in total, were deported to the Soviet Union in that one night. Trains moved eastward under heavy security, carrying entire industries within their freight cars. The Soviets called it mobilization for reconstruction, but to the Western Allies, it was nothing short of an intellectual invasion. Laboratories, blueprints, and prototypes vanished overnight. Entire German research towns like Bleicherode and Nordhausen became ghostly husks. This was not a chaotic looting spree. It was a meticulously planned act of state engineering. Soviet technical officers, many of them veterans of earlier intelligence raids, had spent months compiling dossiers on German experts in rocketry, aviation, radar, and nuclear physics. Every scientist had been categorized by field, rank, and usefulness. When the operation began, it was executed with near-military discipline. In some cases, even factory equipment was dismantled and loaded onto the same trains as the personnel. The goal was not merely to seize technology, but to transplant an entire ecosystem of innovation onto Soviet soil. Among the captives were some of the brightest minds of the German war effort: propulsion experts from Mittelwerk, aerodynamics specialists from Junkers and Heinkel, and metallurgists from chemical conglomerates like IG Farben. They were sent to newly established scientific colonies across the Soviet Union, some near Moscow and Leningrad, others deep in remote industrial towns where foreign eyes could never see. These men and women were assigned to Soviet projects under heavy supervision, often with limited freedom but ample resources. For the Soviet leadership, Operation Osoaviakhim was the masterstroke of post-war reconstruction. Within months, German engineers were working side by side with Soviet scientists, accelerating advancements in aviation, rocketry, and electronics. The V-2 rocket technology, once the pride of Hitler's regime, was reborn under new banners. In secret testing grounds, early Soviet missile prototypes began to emerge, each one a step closer to the dawn of the intercontinental ballistic missile. But for the scientists themselves, life inside the Soviet system was both a privilege and a prison. They were well-fed, protected, and occasionally praised, yet their work was never their own. Letters to relatives back in Germany were censored. Movement between facilities required permission. Disobedience could mean exile or worse. Still, many cooperated willingly, driven by curiosity, fear, or the simple instinct to survive. As Soviet trains carried this human cargo eastward, panic spread among the remaining Allied zones. American and British intelligence reports described the deportations in alarmed tones. The Russians have taken the cream of Germany's scientific elite. It was clear that the balance of power was shifting. The United States and its allies realized that if they didn't act even faster, the Soviet Union would not just rebuild from the ruins, it would leap ahead. The Western reaction was immediate. Operation Paperclip, which had begun quietly, was now accelerated with renewed urgency. Scientists who had been under review for their Nazi affiliations were suddenly approved for relocation. Flights were arranged, documents forged, and immigration restrictions bypassed. In Washington, military officials spoke in cold, logistical terms: brain cargo, technical recovery, priority one assets. It was a race against time, fought not with soldiers, but with scientists and shipping manifests. In Berlin, Allied officers watched helplessly as Soviet convoys rolled eastward, carrying the minds that might soon design the next generation of weapons. The war had ended in May, but in reality a new war had just begun, one waged in laboratories, where silence was deadlier than artillery and secrecy was the new weapon of choice. Operation Osoaviakhim marked the climax of the post-war scramble for German science. It was both the final act of the Second World War and the opening scene of the Cold War. What had started as a moral victory over fascism was evolving into a struggle for technological supremacy between two ideologically opposed empires. By the end of 1946, the Soviet Union had achieved what no army ever could. It had captured the brains of its former enemy, yet in doing so it also triggered an unstoppable chain reaction. In the West, America would answer with an even larger, more permanent strategy to absorb, develop, and weaponize German genius on its own soil. The silent battle for knowledge had reached its decisive turning point, but the story was far from over. The next phase would determine not just who controlled the past, but who would define the future. As the Soviet trains disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying Germany's finest scientific minds, the Western allies found themselves staring at a harsh new reality. The war might have been won on the battlefield, but in the laboratories and research centers scattered across the ruins of Europe, another front had opened, one that demanded speed, secrecy, and absolute control. The United States, determined not to fall behind, transformed Operation Paperclip from a temporary measure into a full-scale state project. What had begun as a series of isolated recruitments now became an institutionalized effort to absorb the intellectual infrastructure of the Third Reich into the American military-industrial complex. By 1947, Paperclip scientists were being relocated under armed escort to military bases, research facilities, and private laboratories across the United States. They arrived quietly, often under assumed names or altered identities, to prevent public outrage. In some cases, these men had been wanted for investigation in Europe. Others were officially listed as missing. The United States government classified their presence under national security laws, shielding them from both journalists and moral scrutiny. For Washington, the calculation was simple. The Soviets had Osoaviakhim. America would have Paperclip. At Fort Bliss in Texas, a group of German engineers led by Wernher von Braun began assembling the foundations of America's missile program. The team worked under military supervision, testing modified V-2 rockets at the nearby White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The desert air carried echoes of Europe's battlefields, but the mission was no longer destruction. It was preparation. These tests produced data that would later feed directly into the U.S. Army's Redstone Arsenal program, the same lineage that would ultimately propel the United States into space. In the following years, the Paperclip network expanded rapidly. Aeronautical experts joined projects at Wright Field in Ohio, where they dissected captured Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf jet engines. Chemists from IG Farben advised on synthetic fuels and polymers that became vital to post-war industry. Medical researchers, some with dark wartime histories, were absorbed into U.S. biomedical and aviation physiology research. Each man was assigned a code name, his past reduced to a single classified file. The moral complexities were buried under layers of bureaucratic necessity. Britain, while slower to move, launched its own coordinated efforts to extract what remained of Germany's technological secrets before the Americans could monopolize them. Under Operation Surgeon, the Royal Air Force recruited German jet engineers to improve its own aircraft designs. In Farnborough, British test pilots flew reassembled Me-262s and Arado jets, studying their capabilities with both admiration and unease. Meanwhile, Operation Backfire conducted controlled V-2 launches at Cuxhaven, allowing British scientists to observe the full flight behavior of the missile for the first time. The reports from these tests were shared with the United States, strengthening the Anglo-American alliance and setting the stage for a joint technological front against the Soviet Union. France, though lacking the same resources, carved its own path. French military authorities began rebuilding their aerospace and nuclear programs using German expertise obtained through negotiated contracts rather than forced recruitment. The Dassault aircraft line and early French rocket initiatives bore unmistakable traces of German design philosophy. It was a quieter, more cooperative form of appropriation, but appropriation nonetheless. The Soviet Union, for its part, was already putting its captives to work. Within 3 years of Operation Osoaviakhim, the first generation of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles had entered testing. German specialists, working under Soviet supervision, provided the mathematical backbone for what would become the R-1 and R-2 missile series, the direct ancestors of the weapon that would one day launch Sputnik. In a bitter irony, the same knowledge that had once terrorized London now became the engine of the space race. What made this period so extraordinary was how quickly wartime enemies transformed into partners of convenience. The United States, Britain, and even the Soviet Union, each claiming moral victory, had built their post-war futures on the remnants of a morally bankrupt regime. Laboratories that had once served Hitler now operated under democratic governments, their scientists wearing new uniforms but conducting the same research. The very technologies that had powered the Blitz and the V-2 campaign were now rebranded as symbols of progress, exploration, and peace. By the end of the 1940s, German science had been fully globalized. Thousands of former Nazi specialists were integrated into American, Soviet, and European industries. What began as a scramble for survival evolved into a long-term dependency. Both superpowers had become addicted to German innovation, and with each new missile test, each jet prototype, and each atomic experiment, the moral divide between victor and vanquished grew thinner. This was the true turning point, the moment when the world's conscience was quietly replaced by calculation. The atomic age was dawning, and no nation could afford hesitation. The scientists who had once built weapons for Hitler were now building the future of human civilization. Yet few could say whose vision that future truly belonged to. From New Mexico's desert to Moscow's frozen airfields, the same equations echoed across two hemispheres. Both sides had inherited the same genius, the same ambitions, and the same ghosts. The laboratories of post-war Europe had become the crucibles of a new conflict, one no longer defined by territory, but by knowledge, reach, and the velocity of progress itself. And as the dust settled on this unprecedented transfer of power, one truth became undeniable. The Second World War had ended, but its science had not. It had merely changed hands, and in doing so, had set humanity on a path toward a future as perilous as it was profound. By the dawn of the 1950s, the world was entering a new kind of battlefield, one without trenches or tanks, where the victors of the Second World War now faced each other across an invisible frontier of science and power. The spoils of Nazi technology had been divided, studied, and reborn under new flags. What had begun as a desperate post-war scramble had now evolved into the defining competition of the age, the Cold War. The consequences of those silent transfers of knowledge, Operation Paperclip in the West and Operation Osoaviakhim in the East, were about to reshape the world in ways no one could have foreseen. In the United States, the once secret German rocket program had become the backbone of a rapidly expanding military-industrial complex. Wernher von Braun and his team, who had arrived as technical specialists in 1945, were now designing the weapons that would carry the U.S. Army into the missile era. Their early work on the Redstone and Jupiter programs gave America its first reliable ballistic missiles, machines capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. The same principles that had guided the V-2 rocket to London were now steering America's nuclear arsenal. By the late 1950s, von Braun's expertise would propel the country into the space race, culminating in NASA's Saturn V, a symbol of human achievement built, ironically, upon the intellectual legacy of the Reich. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was achieving similar feats. The German scientists transported during Operation Osoaviakhim were integrated into Soviet institutions such as NII-88 and OKB-1, where they worked under strict military supervision. Their insights accelerated the Soviet missile program at an astonishing pace. By 1957, just over a decade after their deportation, the Soviets stunned the world with the launch of Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The dawn of the space age had arrived, and its roots traced back not to Moscow or Washington, but to the laboratories of Peenemünde. The same story repeated across other fields. In aviation, the jet technologies pioneered by German engineers revolutionized flight. The British Gloster Meteor and American F-86 Sabre both drew heavily from the aerodynamic data and swept-wing designs of the Messerschmitt Me 262. The Soviet MiG-15, one of the most successful jet fighters ever built, owed much of its form to the same research lineage. For the first time in history, wars would be fought in the stratosphere, faster, higher, and deadlier than ever before. Even outside of weaponry, the German scientific inheritance transformed civilian industries. Synthetic materials originally developed for wartime use, such as plastics, rubber alternatives, and fuel additives, became cornerstones of the modern economy. Medical research, though ethically tainted by its origins, contributed to breakthroughs in physiology, aerospace medicine, and pharmaceuticals. The irony was painful, yet undeniable. Humanity's greatest technological leaps were being propelled by knowledge born in one of its darkest chapters. As these technologies spread across the world, the old moral debates faded into bureaucratic justifications. Scientists who had once served Hitler were now celebrated as pioneers of peace, exploration, and progress. Newspapers published stories of German engineers working for NASA, framing them as brilliant minds who had escaped tyranny. Little was said about where their genius had been forged or who had suffered under their experiments. The narrative of redemption replaced the narrative of responsibility. Meanwhile, the power balance between East and West tightened like a coiled spring. Each side possessed the same knowledge and similar weapons, and both understood what those weapons could do. Missiles once built for the Reich now stood as the first generation of nuclear delivery systems, capable of annihilating entire cities in minutes. The technology that had once rained fire on London now threatened the survival of civilization itself. The Cold War was not merely an ideological confrontation. It was the scientific aftershock of World War II. The laboratories captured in 1945 had become the engines of deterrence, progress, and fear. Each missile test, each jet flight, each satellite launch was a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from morality, could elevate humanity to the heavens or destroy it entirely. In a cruel twist of fate, the nations that had united to defeat fascism had inherited its science, its ambitions, and its capacity for total destruction. The war had ended, but its ghosts lived on, in the data, in the machines, and in the men who had crossed borders not as enemies, but as assets. And as the superpowers armed themselves with the brilliance of their former foe, one haunting question lingered above every laboratory and missile silo. Had the world truly escaped the past, or had it simply re-engineered it for the future? By the mid-1960s, the legacy of Nazi science had fully woven itself into the DNA of both superpowers. What had begun as covert recruitment and forced relocation had now matured into national institutions. In the United States, the German scientists brought under Operation Paperclip had become cornerstones of military innovation, guiding the transition from wartime rocketry to peacetime exploration. Wernher von Braun, once a member of the SS, now stood at the forefront of America's proudest technological moment, the Apollo program. His team's designs, tested in the deserts of New Mexico and refined in the labs of Huntsville, Alabama, would one day lift astronauts beyond Earth's gravity. The Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built by man, was, in many ways, the final evolution of the V-2. It was the weapon reimagined as a vessel of discovery. For the American public, this transformation was a triumph of science over evil. The uncomfortable truth that the same engineering genius had once powered Hitler's war machine was buried beneath patriotic spectacle. Newspapers called von Braun the man who gave America the stars. NASA's rise became the story of redemption. The darker origins of its technology faded into the background. But behind the scenes, government archives told a more complicated story. Declassified documents later revealed that dozens of paperclip recruits had their Nazi affiliations deliberately erased from official records. Some had worked in facilities where slave laborers had perished by the thousands. Yet the logic of the Cold War was relentless. Their knowledge was indispensable, and the moral cost had long been written off as the price of victory. Across the Iron Curtain, the same narrative played out with Soviet precision. The German specialists taken east after Operation Osoaviakhim were no longer captives by the 1960s. They had become assimilated members of the Soviet scientific establishment. Many had trained new generations of engineers who now stood at the forefront of the USSR's missile and space programs. The R-7 rocket, which launched both Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin, carried the genetic code of Peenemünde. The Soviet press celebrated these achievements as proof of socialist superiority. Yet deep inside research centers in Korolev and Moscow, the names of the German mentors were carefully omitted. They were ghosts, acknowledged privately, erased publicly. Meanwhile, Britain and France followed their own paths to technological self-sufficiency, still influenced by the knowledge taken from the ruins of Germany. British jet aircraft, nuclear submarines, and radar systems evolved directly from post-war studies of captured technology. France's early ballistic missile and space programs bore the fingerprints of German engineering, quietly integrated into its national identity. The world's leading powers, each bitterly divided by ideology, were now united by the same inheritance. As time passed, the ethical reckoning could no longer be postponed. In the decades following the war, journalists, historians, and human rights activists began uncovering the hidden truth behind these scientific miracles. Reports surfaced of engineers who had used concentration camp prisoners as test subjects, of doctors whose wartime experiments on humans later informed aviation medicine, and of researchers whose wartime crimes were conveniently forgotten in the name of progress. The revelations were unsettling. How could humanity celebrate walking on the moon without acknowledging the shadows of Mittelwerk, the underground factory where thousands had died building the first rockets? Governments responded with silence or carefully worded statements. Some records were sealed indefinitely. Others were quietly destroyed. Officially, these men had been rehabilitated. Unofficially, they had been shielded. The world's moral clarity, so sharp at Nuremberg, had blurred in the glow of the atomic age. By the 1970s, as détente cooled the open hostilities of the Cold War, the scientific rivalry between East and West had evolved into something larger, a shared human endeavor. Yet its foundation remained stained by compromise. The missiles that once carried warheads now launched satellites. The laboratories that once built engines of death now studied the stars. Humanity had ascended, but the price of that ascent was buried deep in history, beneath layers of secrecy and selective memory. The truth, when it finally emerged, was not a tale of good or evil, but of necessity and blindness, how the victors of one war became the moral prisoners of the next. Each discovery, each milestone, carried within it the echo of a darker past. The same brilliance that had built empires had also enslaved them to their ambitions. And so, by the time the Cold War began to thaw, the world found itself standing on a paradox. It had reached the stars, But it had done so by borrowing the tools of its nightmares. The ghosts of the Reich had not vanished. They had simply changed laboratories. In the quiet decades that followed the Cold War, the archives began to open, and history finally exhaled what it had been holding in for half a century. Beneath the triumph of rockets and the pride of progress lay a truth far more complex than victory or defeat. The race for Nazi science had not been an epilogue to the Second World War. It had been its transformation. The soldiers had gone home, but the scientists had kept the war alive in laboratories, test fields, and missile silos. Their formulas became the new front lines, their equations the new artillery. For all its technological brilliance, the post-war world had inherited a moral paradox. The same minds that once fueled tyranny had become the architects of modern civilization. The V2, designed to rain death on Europe, became the Saturn V that carried humanity to the moon. Nerve gases were reborn as agricultural research. Jet propulsion, once a tool of terror, became the engine of global travel. Out of the ashes of total war rose the marvels of modernity, but also its silence, its selective memory. The world had chosen to celebrate progress while burying the origins of its power. Yet perhaps the deepest legacy of this era was not scientific but human. It revealed how fragile morality becomes when weighed against ambition, how nations that claim righteousness can justify the unthinkable when faced with fear. The United States and the Soviet Union, though enemies, mirrored each other perfectly in this pursuit. Both had fought fascism. Both had harvested its intellect. Both had looked into the abyss and decided that knowledge was worth any cost. History does not offer easy absolution. The laboratories that birthed the Cold War's rockets and reactors remind us that science itself is neither moral nor immoral. It is a mirror reflecting those who wield it. The story of how the world's superpowers stole Nazi science is, in the end, a story of human contradiction, of genius without conscience, of progress born from destruction, of nations that saved civilization while inheriting its sins. And as the last surviving engineers of that era fade into history, their creations still rise above us: missiles, satellites, and space stations, mute monuments to a time when the world traded its innocence for power.